and please call me Stu. And first of all, thank you guys for having me. It's really nice to meet you. I haven't been on a campus in about 7 or 8 years, so it's really cool to come back and meet this, I guess, relatively new club. So thanks again. I think the thing that drew me to reporting in China was number one, was my parents. My dad's side is from Guangdong, Taishan. My mom's side is from the Fujian province. So I think I just wanted to know what made my parents tick. So when I moved to Beijing in 2019, it was cool to just go outside. I lived in a hutong right next to the Forbidden City. And like literally every day I would go outside and I would see something that would make me think, oh, that's why my grandmother was like this. That's why my grandma kept on nagging me to, to get married or something like that. Because it's hard to know whether it's something that's unique to your parents, your family, or something that's wider in Chinese culture. I think the second thing that drew me to it was, you guys know this, I think China is just the most exciting place in the world. You just get off the plane there and there's so many people, a lot of young people, and I saw it even in the year that I was there. Like the country was just getting better every day, whether the street was getting paved or they were putting up a 5G tower in my neighborhood. I think a lot of people in the US or Europe feel like they developed and their infrastructure is crumbling, whereas China is going in the opposite direction. That was a feeling I got. I think number three, China is going to be a superpower, and the U.S. is really worried about that. But I think as a Chinese American, as someone who understands, I think, more of both sides than the average person, I feel like it's a responsibility for me to write about it, to try to write about it in a more fair and balanced way than how a lot of journalists cover the U.S., China, the Western China, I guess, competition right now.
Sure. In your experience in China, what was the greatest difference that you personally encountered relative to how China was portrayed in the Western media in terms of the people and how things unfolded?
I think it's people in other panels have said this already, but I think it's really important to remember that the Chinese people are different from the Chinese governments. I think most people in here understand that. And when you see a headline in a Western newspaper, it often says, China does this. Or every time you turn on CNN and they're interviewing a politician, they'll say, China Communist Party this, Chinese Communist Party that, whether they're a Democrat or Republican. So I think there is there's a lot of villainization of what's going on in China that I think might be unfair. So, but then I go to China and I think Beijingers are just the nicest people, and a lot of them do not exactly have the same view of the Chinese government. So I think that's one thing. That was my takeaway from the year that I spent in China, and also my continued reporting on China.
Sure, fantastic. I was wondering if you could take us through a day in your life when you were in China, what your typical journalistic duties entailed. And I understand that you were in China before and during the COVID outbreak. So if you could talk a little bit about how your duties differed before and after, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so I was hired in China to write about the tech companies. So my main jobs were writing about Alibaba and 5G. So I think on a typical day, I might go to a press conference at the State Council with the MIIT, which runs the infrastructure network in China, and listen to them talk about the progress in 5G. We had this rotation where we would go to the foreign ministry and cover the foreign ministry press conference in the afternoon, where they would talk about, where foreign reporters can ask the government basically anything they want. I went down to Hangzhou several times. I went down to see their 11/11, the Singles Day celebration. So got there at midnight. Taylor Swift was doing that concert. I think in Shanghai. So they live streamed it, and then they set up these like drums all around the campus in Hangzhou. I think there's a Hangzhou native here, right? And every time they broke a record, they would bang the drum, and it was kind of crazy. You just walk through and then they have all these. In China, they do like live streaming like celebrities. Like it's almost like a modern day infomercial where they have these celebrities do nothing but sell things. Is it Li Jiaqi, right? Is that the lipstick king, right? Yep. There's this guy who just tries on different shades of lipstick, and people will see what it looks like, and they brought them on campus that day. So I mean, it's like literally just going outside anywhere in China. Sometimes you see something you'll never see in the U.S. after the pandemic started, my main job was to write about the pandemic. So this is January and February of 2020, before it spread to Europe and the rest of the world. In my neighborhood, they set up these roadblocks at each of the entrances to my neighborhood, and they gave me this entry-exit pass. I had to show them. They took my temperature every time. And most of the businesses closed. And the ones that were open, they did these things that I thought was weird at the time. They outside the grocery store, they drew these 2-meter circles, and you had to stand in a circle to wait, right? And that's pretty common today, but in like January and February of 2020, no one in the world was doing that. And it was like a preview of what was going to happen to the rest of the world. So I'd just go there. I would go to a restaurant where they rearrange all the tables so that you couldn't sit face to face. You had to sit side by side, and there were signs that, try not to breathe on each other, things like that. I would just like literally go outside and see, what the world was like, because it just seemed so foreign to anybody else outside of China. I think it was foreign to people in China too. I think Beijing wasn't hit that hard by SARS, but it was pretty weird.
Sure.
Well, it was weird at the time, but it became normal in the rest of the world.
Sure. So in addition to the strictures placed for preventative measures for COVID, would you also say that your status as an American in the country entailed kind of a greater level of obstacle in terms of performing your journalistic duties?
Well, yeah, for a couple of reasons. The first thing was that pretty soon, and this is before, so I left China on March 28th, and I think in March, the local Communist Party, like the neighborhood committee, I remember they came to my door, they knocked on my door, and they showed me a message that said, please don't hang out with other foreigners because you'll spread the disease. And then they showed it to my American neighbor, but they did not go to the doors of my Chinese neighbors, right? So there was this attempt to send the message that, the foreigners were the main ways that the COVID was being transmitted, at least in my neighborhood, Dongcheng in Beijing. So that was the first thing, was that I think we faced more obstacles than Chinese citizens. I think number two, around that same time, the Wall Street Journal was being attacked by Chinese state-controlled publications like the Global Times and the People's Daily. We had written an opinion piece that had the headline, China is the real sick man of Asia. And I think unbeknownst to a lot of people, that had racist connotations going back to the Opium Wars, almost more than 150 years ago. So we were attacked in the press. So I remember one of my coworkers went to a park, and he was interviewing like aunties for just a story about what the pandemic was like. And then a few of them surrounded him, started yelling at him and calling him a traitor. So I think that was the beginning of, that eventually led us to get kicked out of the country. And that was the beginning of I think, the real downturn in journalistic relations between the U.S. and China. People did not want to talk to foreign media. I think even last year, during the Henan floods, there was a BBC reporter who was kind of confronted by a mob, and then there was I forgot whether it was Global Times or another publication said, Chinese citizens should not give foreign media like a knife to stab them with. So I think basically for the past few years, it's been really hard to talk to the Lao Baixing, the ordinary Chinese citizens. And it makes their job really hard.
Sure. During your time in China at this point, was there anyone or any single demographic that did embrace foreign journalists?
When I was reporting in China, the people who would talk to us would be, you think, for us, it's like, who are the people who would have something gained from talking to us? And those would be the business people. Those would be the people who are trying to create the next ByteDance and, get VC money from the U.S. Sequoia has a big, the big VC firm has a big office in China. So business-wise, that was the least controversial thing. Even despite the U.S.-China, the tech Cold War, people were still wanted to make it known that there were opportunities to invest in China.
Fantastic. I guess, and if it's not too much to ask, would you be able to share or talk about the circumstances that led to your expulsion?
Okay, sure. So as I said, we wrote the opinion piece, which is, so the opinion side and the reporting side of a U.S. publication, they're not related. So one of our opinion writers wrote that article, China is the real sick man of Asia. The Chinese Foreign Ministry asked us to apologize. The Wall Street Journal did not apologize. And then they kicked out 3 of my coworkers. I think this was in February or so of 2020. And then after that, the White House, it was the Trump administration at the time, they kicked out essentially 60 Chinese journalists in the US. So the Chinese government retaliated to the US retaliation by kicking out the remaining US reporters at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. So we had a staff of 14, we went down to 4. I think the New York Times went from 8 to 1, the Washington Post went from, I think, 1 to 0. So it's something like that. I remember I got on, this was March 28th, right? The world was like panicking, shutting down. I remember I got on a flight. It was like a Boeing 777 with 6 people from Beijing to London. And I remember the flight attendants, it was the Air China flight coming down the aisles like every hour and spraying some like disinfectant in the air. I'll never forget that flight. Yeah, that was what happened. And I've been living in London essentially since then.
Sure, great. Had this trend that you saw of, I guess, mutual journalistic exclusion between the United States and China ever occurred prior to your time in China?
There's something called the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, and they track things like that. This, I think, was the golden era of foreign reporting in China was roughly around the 2008 Olympics. The foreign ministry was saying we really want foreign journalists here. And just all my colleagues who have been there since then said it was a good time. You can travel throughout the country. You can go to places like Tibet and Xinjiang with less of an issue than you can today. I think over the past decade there have been people who were effectively expelled. So what that means is that for foreign journalists, you usually get a 1-year press pass there, and you have to reapply for renewal every year. Most people get it renewed, but some people who have written articles that offended the government or the Communist Party did not have their visas renewed. So I think if you go back and look at those Foreign Correspondents Club's records, you'll see that maybe once every 2 years someone had a visa not renewed. But this is the first mass expulsion in generally in the past couple decades like this. There's been nothing like this scale recently.
I see. And after this trend of mass expulsion, do you have any insights into the landscape of journalism in China?
So the main thing that happened was that when Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden talked in, I think in November, one of the few concrete things, maybe the only concrete thing that came out of that was that both the US and China side would restore some journalist visas. So I think, actually I just saw that the Washington Post just has a reporter in Shanghai right now. So that's been slowly coming up. I think it's very few. I think it might be a single-digit amount of journalists from the U.S. going to China right now. So it is still at a low point, but it's slightly higher than it was 2 years ago. Things are very, very slowly moving in a right direction or a better direction in terms of journalistic exchanges right now.
I see. So do you think that the ease of journalistic leeway you enjoyed when you first arrived in China could be attained again in China as this dynamic shifts towards a more positive direction, as you said?
So while there are more American journalists in China than before, so I was back for the Beijing Olympics, which is great, but that was in a bubble where we couldn't leave basically our hotel and the sports venues. But I just in talking to my colleagues, it has not gotten much better than it was 2 years ago. The NPR correspondent in Beijing, Emily Feng, was writing an article about this trend of eating snail noodles in Guangxi. And she went down there, and then she got knocks on the door from the local authorities. And we don't know why. We don't know. We're not sure whether this was a call from Beijing or whether it was an overzealous or very aggressive local official. But she had her interviews canceled, and she was just, again, like, I don't know if hassled is the right word, but she got visits from the police. So this is a story about people like to eat snail noodles in Guangxi, and she couldn't write a story. Shouldn't be a controversial story. So we still get issues like that. And of course, if you try to go to a place like Xinjiang or Tibet, my colleagues and my peers often don't even try, because once you get to the airport, you're met by local authorities and you're ushered on the next plane right back to Beijing. So it's still a challenging environment right now.
Sure, great. Well, phenomenal. Thank you so much. I guess I wanted to pivot more to your tech journalism. So, in a lot of the articles you've written, you've used the term U.S.-China Tech Cold War.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on this label and explain why it's used to characterize the current dynamic between the United States and China.
Yeah, so I think there was a great panel on this yesterday. So I think just first a step back, why isn't this an actual Cold War? The main reason is that there's no proxy hot war going on right now, at least not yet. Who knows how the Russia-Ukraine situation evolves. But right now there's no proxy hot war, and the US and China are not threatening to nuke each other. That's the main thing. I think it's appropriate to use the term technological Cold War because there are people in Washington, D.C. Who are focused on making sure that China does not attain the computer chips and other technology it needs to do two things. I think the first thing is to gain an edge in a battlefield in the military. And the second thing they're worried about is, I think Huawei is a great example, it's economic warfare. If people in Washington, I think both Democrats and Republicans, are worried that if China dominates a specific field like 5G, they'll support a company like Huawei, they'll subsidize them so that every country in the world has no choice but to buy products from a Chinese company. So that hurts, they feel that it hurts capitalist companies, competitors in the US and Europe. There's also the wider fear that Chinese technology, that the Chinese government can force a Chinese company to conduct a cyber attack or conduct spying on their behalf. So those are the main fears that are happening in Washington right now. There is a tech Cold War mindset among the national security folks in Washington.
Sure. I think another thing you've written about is the expansion technologically of China and the United States in overseas countries such as Ethiopia. We see a struggle for 5G expansion there. I was wondering if you could explain what the significance of having control over the distribution and installation of one of these technologies in a country such as Ethiopia, what that would mean for either country.
Okay. There was a great panel yesterday, I think, where we talked about some of the effects of the Belt and Road Initiative. What the U.S. is trying to do right now, they've developed sort of their alternative to the Belt and Road Project. You can look it up. It's called the Development Finance Corporation, and their goal, it's in their mission statement. You can go up and look it up, is to challenge authoritarian governments, and what that really means is essentially China. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to go to countries like Ethiopia, like Eastern Europe, and say, okay, hey, this Chinese bank and this Chinese company is offering you this infrastructure project for 5G or something else. Why don't you look at this American-funded alternative instead? So why is Ethiopia interesting? So I think Africa as a continent is interesting because generally in Latin America, that's in the American sphere of influence or closer ties to America. In Southeast Asia, same with China, physically closer, and there's more historical context there. Africa is really an interesting battleground because there's less of a natural inclination to choose either US or China there. And the US has military interests there. In Ethiopia, for example, if you just look at it on a map, it's in the Horn of Africa, it's near an important shipping or maritime canal, or not a canal, but like it's a strategically important area because it's right by the Indian Ocean. Mm-hmm. And the US also is trying to neutralize terrorist groups there. Military communication runs largely in commercial networks, so they do not trust a network that would be created by a Chinese company like Huawei or ZTE.
Sure. Fantastic. Thank you. I was wondering, do you see this trend of overseas expansion continuing beyond Africa? Are there any other areas of the world that could offer sort of the neutral position that Africa does?
So right now, the U.S. has been really emphasizing this alliance called the Quad between Japan, India, and Australia. They're trying to offer an alternative to China, Chinese-backed infrastructure projects and other alliances in Asia. It's already happening in places like the Solomon Islands in the Pacific Ocean. One of the U.S. top Asia advisors is visiting this small country because they're trying to give the Solomon Islands a choice between accepting essentially aid or an alliance between China and the U.S. right now. So it's happening in many developing countries around the world.
See. So do you think, could you envision a future landscape where much of the world is stratified between the United States and China?
I think it's already happening. I mean, we're already in this world where there's essentially two internet systems, right? You know, in the U.S. we use Facebook and Amazon, Instagram. In China, many of those things you can't access Google or Instagram. You use Baidu and WeChat. We're already in this world where, because of human rights concerns about Xinjiang, where the U.S. says there's a genocide against the Uyghur population, and where China says that's the lie of the century. U.S. clothing companies or Western clothing companies like H&M say we're not going to buy cotton from Xinjiang, and then on the other side you have these Chinese companies. We were just talking about this before, like Anta and Li Ning, saying, oh, we're definitely using cotton from Xinjiang, right? So we're in this world now where Chinese companies have a different supply chain than like Western companies, and more I think people in China are going to wear more Chinese clothing that Americans and Europeans have never even heard of. And I don't know, you can talk about commercialization, but like it's nice to be able to talk to someone in another country about things that you have in common, like whether it's McDonald's or Nike or Anta or Li Ning. But we're in a world now where people in two different countries are using different technological products, and they're going to wear different clothes because of these political tensions right now.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it was a phenomenal answer. You've written a lot about, I guess, struggle for expansion and development in specific technologies such as 5G, microchip processors. I was wondering, are there any areas of tech right now that are currently overlooked that you think in the future could emerge in the center of this struggle?
I think those are the main things. One of the panelists yesterday said, you know, China's great at innovating, but the two things that they're struggling are on like big aircraft engines and microprocessors or just computer chips, right? But I think computer chips, that's the main thing, and that's what's driving a lot of this U.S.-China tech Cold War. You need computer chips for everything, from AI to 5G to self-driving cars, things like that. And then the biggest, most important chip company in the world is in Taiwan, right? And people are wondering whether there's going to be a military conflict over there. I think if you had to boil it down to one big issue, I would keep my eyes on what happens in the computer chip semiconductor world.
Sure, phenomenal. Yeah, I guess one of the closing questions I had was, how do you see the role of journalism, I guess, impacting the current struggle between the United States and China?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to my, one of the things I want to say is that after leaving China, so it was already hard to get an interview with a lot of Chinese people in China. It's even harder now because imagine you're in China and you get a call from a foreign number or you get a WeChat message. Well, the Chinese government or state-backed enterprises, they're monitoring, a lot of these either whether it's phone call or WeChat, right? It's really hard to get the perspective of a Chinese person. So when I write an article, I have a deadline. Who do I talk to? I'll talk to someone who will pick up the phone and give me something. A lot of these people are what we call China hawks, or people who are focused on, neutralizing China's technological advances because of this tech Cold War. And I just want to make that point because I think right now we're missing a lot of the Chinese perspective because we're not physically in China and we just cannot go out on the street and ask an ordinary Chinese citizen what they think about anything, whether it's about the H&M controversy, about the tech Cold War, about Huawei, whatever. So I'm trying to do my best to present a balanced side as a Chinese American, of course, as well. But it's going to be a lot harder to do that if I can't get an ordinary, I can't interview Chinese people. I'll just give you one specific example. During the Beijing Olympics, I was trying to interview a Chinese rapper named After Journey. I don't know if you guys know him. It was because the ice dancing program at the Olympics, they were going to do hip-hop. So we wanted to do a story about what Chinese people think about hip-hop. So what better way to do that than to interview a Chinese rapper? And I remember there were so many negotiations with his agent because they found a picture of me on Weibo, on WeChat, getting like at the airport when I was getting kicked out of the country. Say, hey, it's like, why should I talk to this guy? This guy's getting kicked out of the country for some reason, right? It's a story about ice dancing in Chinese rap, right? So there's just so many barriers right now, and I think that if there were more journalists in the country, it would be beneficial to all sides to give more of a Chinese perspective on these issues and to help people in America and elsewhere understand what's going on in China.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that China has taken kind of a new policy of silence in terms of what it's willing to share globally? And if so, what do you think has informed this new policy of silence?
I don't know if there's a policy of silence. I think recently the Chinese Foreign Ministry and other state bodies have been trying to be more responsive to us and just responding. Oftentimes you send an email, or actually it's not the fax a lot of requests in China. We've been getting more emails than faxes, fax requests for comments. So I'm not sure whether it's fair to say that that silence is a strategy right now. I don't see that actually.
Okay, sure, fantastic. Because you just spoke about, I remember in one of our prior conversations, you're talking about the Made in China 2025 initiative and the ramifications of that. I was wondering, would you be able to explain that a little bit?
Oh, sure. I see what you mean. Okay, so what's driving a lot of this like U.S. response? Why is the U.S. trying to neutralize advances in Chinese technology, whether it's 5G or anything? Well, it's because had the pressure
to get as wide an audience as possible and as many readers as possible. So you are incentivized to report news that are considered to be controversial, or even produce news that might capture the eyes of people around the world. And when China feels that mentality, and when China feels like having foreign correspondents or foreign journalists over in China, it can only do damage to China's image in at a global stage. When it very much feels like journalists are often here, they are out for blood to seek stories that might sort of appeal to a wider Western audience. Even, do you think that underlying kind of issue can be a reason of why China has been so cautious when it comes to inviting journalists over to report?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. I think the answer is yes and no. I don't want to speculate on why the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the Chinese government did what it did. I read, and I know that you spent a lot of time in the UK. So I don't want to name any names, but I do see a lot of news publications put China in a headline, and I think it's an easy way to get people to read a story and perhaps to scare people. That said, I don't think the top tier publications like the Journal, like the Washington Post or the New York Times, Bloomberg, Reuters, I don't think we do that. All of us have been in China for decades. We hire Chinese nationals as coworkers. Many of the people that we employ there are Chinese Americans, Chinese Canadians, Chinese Brits, and I think we try to be as even-handed as possible. Could I don't know if fear-mongering is the right word, but could fear-mongering from other publications that aren't as careful, aren't as balanced? Could that influence the Chinese government? I don't know. I don't know, maybe. But I see where that question is coming from.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Does anyone have any other questions?
I have a question about like during your time at Brown, sort of what opportunities or like what experience that sort of brought you into journalism? Because I know you've worked in Brown Daily Herald, and can you talk a bit more about that, and also how like we as like undergrads can sort of pursue journalism if we are interested in that?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I worked on the high school newspaper in high school, but then when I got to Brown, it was 2004, fall of 2004, there was a presidential election, and I saw a sign that said a presidential candidate. It was a Green Party candidate, Ralph Nader. I think he got like 3% of the vote that year, was coming to campus. And I'd already signed up to work at the Brown Daily Herald then, and they let me cover the event. So I got to sit in the front row. I can't remember whether I met him or not, but I just remember thinking, oh, this is cool. I get to meet like the most important people. And just in February, I was in the Bird's Nest. I saw Xi Jinping in person. I was like maybe like 100, 150 yards away from him. I just thought, but that's the same feeling that I had when I was at the Brown Daily Herald and just this close to the presidential candidate. The best advice I would give to anybody who wants to pursue a career in journalism is that the most important things are what you publish. So whether it's an article or a photo, you just have to do it over and over. And it doesn't matter what publication you publish it in. Could be the Brown Daily Herald or the Indie. Could be the Providence Journal. Could be something even smaller. You just have to do it over and over. It's just like practicing basketball. You just got to take 100 3-pointers a day, because I don't know if anybody writes for any journalistic publication right now, but you in the back of my head, I know, oh, those were the 3 best stories I did last year. What made them stand out? So you just got to practice. You got to do it over and over. Doesn't matter what your grades are. It doesn't matter, what your major is. The thing that people want to see is, oh, this person wrote this, and this is a great article. And the quantity doesn't really matter, but it matters in that the repetition helps you get better. So just do it and just give it a shot. And what was the second part of your question?
No, it's just like any advice for us, and I think you just answered that.
Okay,
so
yeah,
thank you.
yeah, practice.
Phenomenal. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Have you like worked as a journalist in like countries like other Asian countries, like other than like China, and or do you like plan to like work in those countries, and like what is your like experience like working there?
Okay, I have not worked in other Asian countries, although so when we got so I think there were about 18 of us who got kicked out of China in early 2020, and what the foreign ministry said was that we cannot work in mainland China or Hong Kong and Macau. I think that was the first time they excluded Hong Kong and Macau from this too. The people who got kicked out spread out around the world. The people who continued to write about China went to Taiwan or Singapore. These are some of the places that I'm thinking about moving back to, because I want to be in that world. And Singapore is particularly interesting because after a lot of Western companies got scared of being in Hong Kong after what they thought was a democratic crackdown, so they moved their Asia headquarters to Singapore. So I think it's interesting. I think Taiwan is also very interesting for many reasons. I think one concern I would personally have is that it's hard to you're going to be surrounded by a lot of people who are very wary of China, and I don't know exactly how that would influence my reporting. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I am interested in going back to as close to China as possible.
I have another question, especially as an international Chinese student who have resources to read both news inside of China and news outside of China. Often when it comes to issues like Xinjiang, you read so many different stories, different interpretations of what's going on, and no one really seems to know what exactly is going on because China hasn't been allowing journalists to report there. And on many issues alike, I think it is easy to feel lost when your family is saying otherwise to what you're reading the news, especially in the Western sort of reportings. How would you do you have any advice for someone who is navigating through that multiplicity and that kind of a world of different ideas?
I'll try to answer your question. The short answer is that it's tough, and I don't have a specific answer for that. But you might be in a similar situation to a lot of people in Ukraine right now who have family in Russia. So you can go and Google these stories. There are a lot of Ukrainians who have parents in Russia who do not believe that Ukraine has been invaded by Russia. And there's a lot of heartbreaking stories about young people telling the parents, no, the missile just, landed in my neighborhood. And the parents saying, no, we turn on Russian media and we don't see that. I can't speak to that. My parents have been in America for decades now, so and they don't read Chinese media, so I don't know how to personally relate to that or give you advice. But I will say that this is not a situation that's unique to international Chinese students.
Thank you.
So you talked about neutralizing Chinese tech development, but another thing I want to ask is that, obviously companies like Huawei are government-backed, but for U.S. company, for other countries that's not either U.S. or China, shouldn't they be concerned that the American tech companies are also working with the U.S. government? Because, you got Edward Snowden about a decade ago revealing the secret plans of the U.S. government, and, the U.S. government was even spying on, Merkel and the leader of an important NATO ally. So how do you see this neutralizing thing in China and not talk about neutralizing, American company?
Yeah, that's a great question. To put it really bluntly, if you went to Washington right now and you pose that question to them, if you cut through all the crap and everything, at the end of the day, the answer is, who would you? This is a really cynical answer, but the answer is, who would you rather have? Who would you rather give the potential? Who would you rather have spy on you? Would you rather have China or the U.S. spy on you? That's super cynical. There's a lot more nuance than that. But that's the option essentially at the end of the day. And if you give Germany that choice or Britain that choice, I think there would be. I mean, that's a bad situation, right? But I think there's a clear. Well, I don't know how Germany would answer that question. I have a guess, but I don't know. I think the second point is I like to raise, and that is that while the U.S. and China dominate like a lot of technology, there are some European companies that are caught in the middle. There's one in the Netherlands that makes called ASML. They're basically the most important chip company you've never heard of. They make tools for Intel and other chip companies. And the U.S. is pressuring the Dutch government not to send those tools to China because they need those tools to make advanced chips. You could argue that, maybe they do have legitimate national security concerns, but you could also argue that this is a way to, boost American industry in some ways too. It's more complicated than that because of the intricacies of the chip industry. But there are the U.S. is also trying to boost U.S. companies and at the expense of Chinese ones, and maybe there's some collateral damage in places like Europe too. So that's something that I'm trying to keep a close eye on.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much for coming abroad and speak. My questions has three sub questions per se. So the first one is what do you see is as vague as possible the future of journalism in the sense of its dynamic, whether that be how Chinese journalism, U.S. journalism, etc., how they interact, or however you want to interpret that question. So that's the first of all. The second part is what is the challenges encountering journalists across the world, and how do you see those challenges either being resolved or worsened in the upcoming years? And the last part is just how will the previous two questions affect the larger geopolitics across the world? Because one of the really biggest forces I see in 2020 and 2021 is how powerful narratives actually are, not just in China, but in US as well. I'm just wondering what exactly are some of the impacts that we're going to see as journalism keeps evolving, influencing the narrative across the world, as well as just other things happening internationally.
Okay. Let's take these one by one. I
Yep.
can't remember all three. So can you? Let's start with,
Sorry.
what's number one?
So the first one is what's the future of journalism in the sense of how the dynamic of journalists across the world is going to interact in like 10 years and 20 years. It's pretty vague, but
Just like journalism in general,
Yep.
or as it relates to. Okay. Well, there are. I don't know how many. There are a lot fewer jobs in journalism right now than there were like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So I think what Joey was referring to before, there is this pressure to look at the stats and how many clicks and get more clickbaity headlines. There is that pressure. I think the top tier publications I mentioned try to avoid that. But the reality is that there are fewer foreign journalists, foreign correspondents than there were 10, 15 years ago. So we have to be more selective about what we write about right now. So a lot of time that just means jumping on a breaking news story. It's like I have two coworkers in China right now, right? So they're trying to write about the Shanghai lockdown, they're trying to write the plane crash, they're trying to write about things like the Hunan. They got to choose. We can't do it all. There's only two of us. There's going to be it's not a great situation. We got to pick our spots and just focus on the really big things. Things are going to fall between the cracks more so than they used to. That's a sad reality.
I guess like it's a great follow up to the second question, which is like what are some of the major challenges facing journalists either right now or ahead in the future? It doesn't have to be limited to China. It can also just because obviously there are challenges facing journalists in China.
Yeah. People are going to have to be. People are just going to have to be. People are going to. You're faced with a bunch of bad decisions. If you're in China right now, you can write about Shanghai. You can write about you can only pick one, right? I mean, like you can spend the next months. You can spend that entire year writing about the effects of the Shanghai lockdown, right? But then there's the plane crash. But then there's the what's happening with the flood. Recovery in Hunan, and just a bunch of what's happening in Xinjiang. There's a bunch of things. So. People are just going to have to pick their spots. I will say there are some new journalism organizations popping up, and maybe that'll fill the gap. My friend here, I guess he just left there. Is in audio journalism. That's a growing area. A lot more podcasts and stuff. So I think journalism as we know it, in terms of like CNN and the big newspapers, aren't going to be like they were, as far as I can tell, like they were 10, 15, 20 years ago when we had a lot more money. It's going to be. Yeah, it's just going to be less, but there might be new areas like podcasts where there might be more coverage. So that's how I see it right now. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but that's where things are headed right now.
If no one else has a question, I will jump in with the third.
Yeah,
but
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
I came in late, so I'm not sure if you already talked about this. I'm sorry, but at London and Beijing Olympics, did you notice any interesting difference in terms of like event organization and the general vibes per se, like anything between the East and the West?
Yeah. So I covered this past Olympics in just 2 months ago, and then the 2012 London Olympics, and then I attended the 2008 Olympics as a spectator, and for both 2008 and 2022. There were just so many volunteers there. I think they recruited them from Tsinghua and Beida and is it Renmin University? Like they just recruited from the local universities. They all spoke English. They were all really friendly. I think one dynamic that I saw in February, just 2 months ago, was that they were really, really all the students, all the volunteers in Canada were really, really eager to practice their English because of the quarantine situation. A lot of foreigners have left. There haven't been many to come in, so there's just like fewer people, like native English speakers, to practice their English on. They're all phenomenal. I love that. The Beijing Olympics were super weird. Did you guys have any friends who were volunteers there or anything like that? I don't know.
Actually, a teacher at my school.
Yeah.
He competed in the 2008 Beijing Olympics.
Oh, that's cool.
He got a medal or something.
What event?
maybe ice skating.
Ice skating. Okay. Well, okay. So a lot of journalists joke that it was kind of like sports prison because they built up these fences around each of the hotels we were staying in. We had to get on a bus that only took us to like the ice skating rink and the skiing center, and we couldn't leave. And it's fun because it's sports, but you also you couldn't leave because of the zero COVID policy there. And then the stadiums were like a quarter full because of the social distancing. I don't know. It felt, you asked a question about like why did I get into journalism? I felt really privileged because this was literally a thing that like very, very few people could see, and I was here seeing all this in person, and it was cool. And I think all the volunteers there made me feel really welcome. But it was very similar to 2008. I mean, I could go out in Beijing, right? I could leave this bubble. I think in London it was there were fewer volunteers, but it was an English speaking city, so it was just more I don't know if laid back's the right word. It just felt more normal. And Beijing made it a big event, and they just put volunteers in every corner, and it was very welcoming to me. And whereas London, it was just like just part of the city, just people going on their daily life. It seemed like less of a big deal in London in that way.
That's my third question.
Yeah.
So you were talking about how journalism, the way journalism is changing, as well as the impacts of journalism. Perhaps lessening is not the right word, but definitely transforming in the sense of how journalists can make an impact. My question is just like going ahead in the future, let's say 10 years from now, what kind of impacts do you see journalism making? Would it be different from the kind of things we're seeing today? How would narratives change geopolitics? Incorporating the fact that countries are becoming radically different. I'm talking specifically China, US. How would journalism interact with geopolitics? Making impacts. How would journalists make impacts in the future?
Okay, I don't think journalism has I don't think the main goal of journalism has changed at all. At least I'm 35 years old. In my lifetime. The way it's delivered has been different, but you see podcasts winning, big prizes now, and not just winning prizes, but affecting change in government. The only thing is that there are fewer journalists, but I don't think the main mission has changed. I think it's to show the world, is to show people how the world works. And what I'm trying to do, what I'm really focused on right now, my job is to write about how these tensions affect business. And that we have people using different internet systems and wearing different clothes in the world because of these tensions. I don't think that mission would be different 10 years in the future. I don't think it would have been different 10 years in the past. I think the way we read and hear news will be different, but the main goal will be the same.
Fantastic. Does anyone have any closing questions? All right. Well, I think in that case, we'll end up wrapping up the panel. Stu, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure to talk with you, and I think we've all benefited immeasurably from being here. So thank you for that.
All right. Thank you, David, and thank you for having me. I was having a really good time here.